Hi there everyone, and welcome to my presentation about stylized assets digital sculpting. This module had us focus on Sea of Thieves and its art style, so that's exactly where I started. I began by breaking down some existing work from Sea of Thieves into some simple blocky shapes to get a feel for how they were put together and the silhouette they created. After analysing their shape, I moved on to focus on the colour schemes. They were full of vibrant hues and overly saturated colour, each relating to a different area of the game. For example, most of the Ashen objects share a molten orange accent colour with a base colour of dark browns and blacks, which complement each other nicely. You can see some further examples of how I broke down these assets here as well as some speculation into some methods of how they were made. For example, the mermaid statue in the bottom left looks as if it was sculpted as a whole and then fragmented inside of Unreal Engine using its fracture tool with some emissive on the inside. After a while of dissecting the assets, I moved my focus onto island concepts and their shape language. These concepts are taken from the Sea of Thieves art book, and I cut designs for some islands. A common familiarity I noticed in most islands was they all seemed to have a central stone or cliff, with areas of beach to support it. They also had a pathway leading up to some sort of natural high point, which started getting me thinking about how I wanted my island to be. Continuing my research into islands, I pulled out key assets that were present on each island to help me form an idea of an asset list for my island of my own. You can see here my asset list with a skull, a campfire, dock, rocks, barrels, palm tree, grass, ferns, sand-covered pebbles on the shore, and fish. There's also plenty of additional references used while creating assets that were kept organized in a pure ref board. This allowed me to neatly keep all my references in one file without worrying if they would fit on a page together. I found this helped streamline my workflow a lot compared to using something like a PowerPoint for mood boards. Here's also some useful resources I used while using my pre-production. Once I had a basic idea of what islands in Sea of Thieves often required, I started to shape my own inside of Unreal Engine using the landscape tools. You see here a bird's eye view of that. The initial island shape was designed around 3 cameras placed in focal points for the landscape, with the idea of having the peak of the island take up the middle third of the composition, in the 2 front angles and a pathway leading up to the peak. The back angle was less refined and changed later, as you can see below. You can see here the block out versus the final render, with little tweaks being made to the composition. This angle remained mostly the same throughout all of development, and I don't think it ever changed. However, the back angle was tweaked slightly since I felt the cut off on the left was a bit too sharp and it wasn't quite getting the focus I wanted. Here are some quick development GIFs, just going over the development cycle from the white box to some assets being temporary and then the final product being taken from different stages in development. Moving on to the process of actually making my assets, I started with the barrel, one of Sea of Thieves' most common assets, and created a basic low poly model inside of Blender before exporting it into ZBrush to add details like planks, dents, and divots in its surface. Once the sculpting was finished, I used Z-Remesher to lower the poly count for a low poly model. This would then be used as a base for the bake detail of the high poly mesh inside of Substance Painter. Before baking could begin though, I had to unwrap the low poly barrel inside of Blender so that the bake would be clean and no issues would arise. You can see that here. After all that is done, the final product looks something like this. With an organic asset like the skull, the process is a little different compared to other assets. Instead of starting with a low poly, the skull started as a sphere primitive inside of ZBrush and was molded into a rough shape, with only the primary forms defined. Once the primary forms were defined, I moved on to secondary and tertiary forms. Once the sculpt was done, instead of Z-remeshing like I did for the barrel, I used a method involving drawing each polygon onto the mesh of the skull itself, making sure to keep edge flow optimized, especially around the areas like the eyes and the nose sockets. Then once again, you unwrap the low poly and begin texturing in Substance Painter using either hand-painted brushes, generators, fill layers, or a mix of all 3. You can see here the final result again. The method of making the tree trunk isn't too dissimilar from the skull. However, instead of using a sphere to start with, I started using something called Z-spheres that link together to form a shape. As for the leaves, those only had a low poly model made inside a blender and were made into the rough silhouette of a leaf with very little detail. The detail would be added through texturing and opacity masking to create cuts and notches into the leaves. For grass, the process was the same as making the tree leaves, however was even easier since it just required 3 intersecting planes in a triangle for its low poly model. The process of making a light asset in my case, a campfire, was the same as the barrel but with more complex shapes, from an initial low poly model into a high poly ZBrush sculpt to a retopologized and optimized low poly model. It then followed the same steps as before for texturing, such as an unwrap, then Substance Painter for texturing, and then exporting into Unreal. Where the process differed from other assets was when it was imported into Unreal Engine and its required particle effects for its fire. This was done using Unreal's Niagara system alongside some fire shapes I made in Photoshop. And the final product looks something like this. The water dock followed the exact same method of creation as the campfire, except for the fact it was duplicated after it had been textured to make the dock longer without taking extra time. You see here the unwrap, base color and reference maps, and then the final result. Sea of Thieves has a lot of decals and posters scattered around its world. I wanted to recreate one of, in my opinion, the most iconic posters in Sea of Thieves, those being the Order of Souls bounties. These are given to the player through quests and have a slight glow to the edges, which makes them feel ethereal and otherworldly. To create this poster, I worked mainly in ZBrush by starting with a primitive plane, using the trim cut brush to section and cut it into multiple different polygroups. The cuts were then deleted and the mesh was recombined into one polygroup before adding thickness and remeshing for clean topology. The edges are then beveled so that the more normal information will be visible when converted into a decal. To convert it into a decal, I created an additional plane behind the high poly to serve as a low poly mesh, and then color coded the high poly to bake down an opacity mask using color IDs in Substance Painter. Texturing remained the same, except for the added task of recreating the concept of the Gold Hoarder skeleton in Photoshop with the silhouette style of the Sea of Thieves bounties. Another crucial step was making sure the opacity mask was baked down so that it would be used as that it could be used as a deferred decal inside of Unreal Engine. You can see here inside of Unreal Engine, the close-up and against the rock. Through the use of math nodes inside of Unreal Engine to create the formula you can see below, and it creates a bit more of an accurate Sea of Thieves water effect, along with panning normal maps to go along with the waves. For the sand material, Substance Designer was the choice of software since it allowed me to use a plethora of different shapes, grunge maps, and methods of combining images and level adjustments to create a complex set of material outputs like base color, roughness, normal, and also height. You can see here the final look inside of Unreal, along with an example of the material setup. Even from the first iteration of the island, I was sure I wanted two main things. A fire beacon at the peak of the island to signal wayward pirates and convey info from the island, and secondly, I was sure I wanted a cozy campfire that would provide a bit of a respite for travellers to cook fish and they had gathered from the nearby rock. Another area of storytelling that was added for me was the wanted poster. I chose to recreate a poster from a cut design of a Gold Hoarder enemy, and added small details about him. For example, a small story saying that he was last sighted on my island, called Tadpole Island, was just a small little touch that made it feel a bit more alive. At the start of this module, the task of creating a whole island diorama seemed monumental. However, once I understood the respective pipelines for different types of assets, it became easier to manage, and eventually I even managed to create some assets from my asset list that I wasn't sure I was going to be able to. For example, the cliff face seemed like something that would need to be cut due to time constraints. However, after practicing ZBrush, the carving tools, and retopology, I realized I could use the same 9 stones in different shapes and sizes to create varied and unique cliff face that felt like it fits inside of the Sea of Thieves world. I feel like I remained true to the art style of Sea of Thieves, but I think I could take it further and add even more variety into the scene with some more lush foliage and vibrant colours, just like the overgrown islands I was inspired by. That's all I have to say for now. Enjoy some of my final renders of the work.